was made.
How in the world are we going to speak about democracy when a tiny portion of society controls the financial and the material resources of society? How can you have a democratic system? For instance, the United States is the best example. If 1 or 2 or 3% of the population has the vast majority of wealth in society, how can you have a democracy? Because economic power is translated into political influence. That's been a lesson throughout history. So in the United States, the mechanism is that the wealthy and the powerful are able to finance electoral campaigns. If you want to be a viable candidate in any major election in the United States, you need vast resources. You need millions and millions of dollars. The last elections, how many hundreds of millions of dollars were spent by each candidate in the last presidential elections. And unless you're independently wealthy, like Ross Perot, and you have your own hundreds of millions of dollars to invest, you need to turn to those in society that can supply these resources. You need to turn to the wealthy and the powerful. And that means that you subordinate your program to the needs of the wealthy and the powerful. That's the particular mechanism in the United States. But wherever we look in the world, we see that economic power translates
plutocracy, those very wealthy people, it's about 0.04, one fraction of 1%. It's less than 1%. When you hear, the top 1% owns 40%, it's less than 1%. It's about 145,000 individuals. They make up this super rich class. You know, Gore Vidal was telling us that when Ronald Reagan went rushing over to the Bohemian Grove and said, I want to crack at the presidency now. I'm governor of California. It's my time. They said, no, Ronnie, you got to wait. It's 1972, that's going to be tricky, Dick. Richard Nixon. He stepped back. He wasn't going to take on the power of the wealth. He's serving that power.
Mr. Reagan is for freedom, and he is for the people.
When people talk about the rich in this country, they really don't seem to have any idea how rich the rich really are. The very top is that fraction I just said of 1%. That's where it goes off the charts. The analogy is that if we could represent our income and wealth by playing blocks, children's playing blocks, each block represents $1,000. Most of us would have a pile that would go up maybe anywhere from 6 to 10 or 15 feet at most. But for that top super rich, this is Heilbronner's analogy, the piles of blocks would go up many times over the Eiffel Tower, many times higher than the Eiffel Tower. It would go out of sight.
Concentrations of wealth and power are fundamentally anti-democratic. That whenever you've got a monarchy or a giant corporation like the East India Company, you have a force within society that's going to dominate and dictate and control.
The company became so successful that it stopped being simply a trading empire and became a political one. At its peak, it even had its own army of around 200,000 men. By the early 19th century, it controlled much of India, making laws and raising taxes.
Today, we live in a society that is probably more economically stratified than any other country in the world. Literally, 2 or 3% of wealthy Americans own and control probably 80% or more of everything worth owning in our country. And we've seen how these pro-corporate political policies over the last 20 years are really coming home to roost. The middle class has been decimated, and the super rich have done quite well. In fact, only the super rich have really done quite well. Fundamentally, I think the problem here is that we have this system in the United States of politics that is beholden to private money. And even a candidate like Barack Obama, who campaigned as a change agent and actually did get a record number of contributions from small, average Americans, managed at the same time to get a record amount in contributions from the biggest interests out there, the insurance industry and Wall Street in particular. And when your political system depends on who can pour the most money into essentially TV propaganda, TV ads, and that's really the biggest determinant in the race. Can you hire the best marketers and PR people and advertisers, and can you raise enough money to really run a campaign that's going to overwhelm the airwaves? If you can do that, your odds of winning are probably about 4 or 5 to 1.
As to him being a phenomenon, the only phenomenon that Obama was the creation and manipulation of the media. He was a brand, the Obama brand. He was a creation and continues to be a creation / manipulation of the corporate media. Let us be honest about that. Hope, how dare that word be used and distorted the way the Obama brand has used it and distorted it.
The advertising industry gives a prize every year for the best marketing campaign of the year. 2008, they gave it to the Obama campaign, who beat out commercial competitors. The idea is we market candidates the same way we market toothpaste or lifestyle drugs or automobiles. Of course, it helps to have a lot of money. And in fact, Obama greatly outspent McCain, and not because of popular contributions. It came mostly from financial industries. He was their candidate. And his policies will presumably respond to his constituency.
Themselves.
To manage wealth requires keen insight, the heart and focus of the hunter, and the understanding that wealth is not about money, but the possibilities it creates. Just as volatility may produce turbulence, there may also be dazzling moments when lightning strikes. Introducing Goldman Sachs Wealth Management.
Who got us into the financial crisis? People like, for example, Robert Rubin, the Secretary of Treasury under Clinton. His great achievement, one of his great achievements, was to destroy the New Deal legislation. It's called the Glass-Steagall Act, which protected commercial banks from risky lending. So it ensured that commercial banks would have enough liquidity, and they would be regulated, and therefore you'd be pretty safe when you put your money in a bank. Investment firms, on the other hand, take out risky loans, try to make very high profit. If they get into trouble, they expect the government to come in and bail them out, and so on. The Glass-Steagall Act separated those. Rubin led the way to revoking the Glass-Steagall Act. As soon as he did so, he left the government, became a director of Citigroup, a major financial institution, and used the new powers to enable Citigroup to control insurance companies and investment firms and so on, and made plenty of profit from that for a few years until, of course, the whole system collapsed. And Citigroup is now getting tens of billions of dollars of taxpayer money to keep them alive. Okay, that's Robert Rubin. He was succeeded as Treasury Secretary by Lawrence Summers.
And as one of the great economic minds of our time, Larry has earned a global reputation for being able to cut to the heart of the most complex and novel policy challenges. With respect to both our current financial crisis and other pressing economic issues of our time, his thinking, writing, and speaking have set the terms of the debate.
Summers, one of his main achievements was to block legislation that would regulate exotic financial instruments, credit swaps, and so on. The religion under which they operate is what's called the efficient market hypothesis. Everything will take care of itself if you just leave markets alone. They're just magic. no empirical basis, no theoretical basis, but it's a good tool for wealth of the nation. They can make a lot of money out of it. So Summers blocked that legislation. And another factor in the current disastrous financial crisis is the fact that these exotic instruments exploded out of control, and nobody knows who owns what assets are worth. So again, the government has to step in and bail out the wealthy.
That's all I've had.
So we keep producing more and more for the employer, productivity rises, but the employer doesn't give us any more at all. You do not need an advanced degree in economics, and being a professor of economics, I wouldn't advise it anyway. But you don't need it to understand that if workers are producing more and more for the employer, but he's not giving them more and more, then the whole benefit of rising productivity accrues to profits. So the people who made out like bandits in the last 30 years were the employers, number one, and whoever could get a piece of the profits the employers were getting. We call those people stock owners, shareholders. People who have a piece of a company can get a piece of the profits the company earns. That's how our system works. They did wonderfully. The quintessential story comes to this apex. I've been telling you how Americans went on a borrowing binge. Have any of you wondered, where did the money come to lend all those Americans all that money? Who's the lender? What's the source of the money? And if you understand what I'm about to tell you, you'll understand in a nutshell the remarkable quality of our society over the last 30 years. Because the origin of the money lent to the American worker were the extraordinary profits of American business. They had made so much money because the productivity went up when the wages went down that they turned around and used the extra profits that they got by not paying higher wages to lend it to the workers instead. Think of yourself now, and some of you will enjoy this, as if you were a businessman or a businesswoman, an employer. This is as close to nirvana as business gets. Instead of paying your workers higher wages over time as they work harder and better for you, you don't. Instead of that, we give them a loan, which they have to give back to us with interest. If I had a portable record machine now,
Is this what you meant when you wrote that every one of this country's primary institutions is anti-democratic in spirit, design, and operation?
It is.
That's a strong statement. Every one of the country's primary institutions, meaning?
Meaning educational institutions, large-scale educational institutions, meaning institutions of government, bureaucratic institutions, major institutions of media and communication, major institutions of a recognizably economic kind as well, and I think large cultural institutions too. Again, something like the media.
Is anti-democratic, meaning?
Meaning that two things. One, hierarchical. They're all hierarchical structures, and hierarchy means inequality, of power. Secondly, I think they're fundamentally elitist in character, which is to say that each of them involves a definition of who should lead or control that institution based upon criteria which can only be met by a relatively few. So it becomes a way of excluding.
And that means anti-democratic. You do not consult the people. You do not involve the people.
The basic idea of liberal democracy is that the only economy that's consonant with liberal democracy is capitalism. And capitalism presupposes a class structure in which those who own and control the means of production own and control the means of production. and they have a lot more clout politically than those who don't. For me, that's a fundamentally undemocratic political economy. So for me, democratic capitalism is a contradiction in terms. For me, the only system of social relationships that's consonant with democracy is a high level of economic independence and economic equality. Because without economic independence, if I'm dependent for somebody else for what I have access to live, might be a nice guy, might employ me, but I'm weak relative to him. I'm powerless relative to him. And he's got the hammer on me. And I damn well better satisfy and please him, or I'm in trouble. And I'm in trouble at the level of necessity, okay, of living and dying. And certainly not living well, but maybe not living at all. So for me, socialist democracy or democratic socialism is in fact the only coherent mix of political democracy and social economic equality that adds up in my mind to something that looks like democracy. So I argue that capitalist democracy is in fact a sham. It's never going to be a real democracy because it can't. And the only real democracy, at least then theoretically, is a socialist democracy. What you immediately run into if you make that argument, how about Russia? What about Stalin? What about Pol Pot? What about they drag out all these horror stories of societies that have purportedly tried socialist democracy. And my answer to that, and my short answer to that, is there's very little in those societies that I would credit as in any way socialist or democratic. Okay. In the Soviet Union, it wasn't the people who owned and controlled the means of production, it was the state.
The continuous, consistent growth of centralized power in our society. People think of Ronald Reagan as an opponent of state power and as someone who wanted to get government off our backs.
I would like to take the lead in taking government off the backs of the American people and turning you loose to do what I know you can do.
But actually, one of the legacies of the Reagan era is a stronger state, a state that doesn't do as much in terms of regulation of the economy as the states growing out of the New Deal, Fair Deal kind of tradition, but a state which, in terms of defense, in terms of the protection of American interests abroad, in areas such as the advancement of technology or the law and order state, all of those involve extensions of national power.
Is this for better or worse?
I think it's for worse. I think it's for worse because it's been accompanied, as we know, by an incredible amount of apathy on the part of the American electorate in terms of the simple fact of voting. It is a less alert, a less involved electorate at the national level.
You say in your book that the story of the United States is drawing to a close, and you call the U.S. a zombie empire. And especially in the light of the recent elections, when we see Republicans again enjoying their power, it really feels like a circle. Republicans, Democrats. Where will that change come from that you talk about?
Well, it's certainly not going to come within the existing system. What we're seeing now that you just referred to, this flip-flopping, the two parties are so close together on the overall ideological framework from left to right that there's not enough differentiation. So big swaths of the population don't feel represented at all, which is why our voter turnout is among the lowest in the industrialized world. The change is not going to come from the D's and the R's, the Democrats and the Republicans, and the fact that people are constantly just voting against the party in power is a symptom of that. People are frustrated. The message they're sending is not, right now we support the Republicans, nor was it in 2008 we support the Democrats. The message is we hate them both, so we're voting no. The story of the United States government as the 20th century invading, bullying, imperialistic, economic and political empire, that is coming to a close. It is unhealthy for us, and it's obviously terrible for the world.
The suspicion about elections is extrapolating from the environment in which we function, an environment in which elections are a joke, an environment in which, Sarah Palin's hairdresser earns more than McCain's foreign policy advisor. Why is that? Because it makes sense. All right? It's not because they're stupid, it's because her hair matters more than his foreign policy proposals. Why? Because the population knows the foreign policy proposals are lies. They know there's no reason to believe what anybody says about anything like that. On the other hand, her hair is truthful.
Former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin joins us from her living room in Wasilla, Alaska. What'd you do to your hair?
Do you like it? I tried to look like you.
Okay. Yes, I'm not used to you having that many curls. It's kind of cute, but it's a surprise just to see you pop up there with the curls. Great. What's the weather like in Wasilla today?
Thank you.
So the national government becomes stronger, but the participation, knowledge, and involvement of the people diminishes.
Absolutely. And at the same time, it's becoming much more of a surveillance and control state in terms of the way that it intervenes in, knows about, pries into individual lives.
Growing out of what you just said, this will strike you as a very simplistic question, but I need to ask it. Do we have a democracy?
It isn't a simplistic question, and the answer is, I think we don't.
I'm voting because I have the right to vote.
It's a beautiful thing to be able to vote. Vote because for the first time ever, an African American can end up in the White House.
Vote because for the second time in history, a woman is running for vice president.
If you're not voting for yourself, vote for people like me.
Vote for the future of your children.
Voting for education, health care.
I'm voting for a better planet.
I'm voting because when I was growing up, my father told me that if you don't vote, then you have to shut up.
And every vote counts. That's why I vote.
I like Capono.
I don't think the idea of democracy and the idea of a strong state, centralized, inherently bureaucratic and administrative in its structure and orientation, that those are compatible notions. I think democracy does imply involvement, shared power, dispersed power, and above all, a significant equality. And I think state power means the opposite of those things. And similarly, I think the democracy clearly is at odds with corporate structures and the power of corporate structures.
Hierarchy.
Exactly. And also power that's unaccountable, power that basically is unresponsive and is concerned with other things, bottom lines, profit margins, and the rest.
Don't we, in fact, have a rather thinly concealed power structure of large public institutions and private corporations?
I think the most important developments in the last 25 years or so has been the closer integration and intertwining of those two dominant structures of power, economic and political power.
The definition of polyarchy that we have in the social sciences is a system where the participation of masses of people is limited to voting among one or another representatives of the elite in periodic elections. And in between elections, the masses are now expected to keep quiet, to go back to life as usual, while the elite make the decisions and run the world until they can choose between one or another elite another 4 years later. So really, polyarchy is a system of elite rule, and a system of elite rule which is a little more softcore than the type of elite rule that we would see under a military dictatorship, for instance. But what we see is that under a polyarchy, the basic socioeconomic system does not change. It does not become democratized. Wealth is not redistributed downward. You don't see a more equitable redistribution of wealth and resources. So that's the key. Socioeconomic dictatorship and free elections.
I think an economic system that works in the ways I've just gone through with you, that ends up sending money to China, that leaves people unemployed, that leaves people losing their homes. You know, we are a wonderful country. We now have a record number of homeless people, side by side with a record number of unoccupied homes. We are a country in which we line up the homeless people to stare across the street at the empty homes. This is crazy. A system as unstable as this, as costly socially as this, is a system that this population ought to have the courage to question. The Cold War is 20 years behind us. 20 years ago, Americans were afraid to question capitalism because that might make you disloyal and be a proponent of communism or socialism. The socialism and communism of Russia is over, of Eastern Europe is gone, and the Chinese look more like us every day anyway. So maybe now we can have the courage to say, can't we do better? Can't we do better than this? Do we have to live with this? It's long past due that we face up to it and ask, if all of this happened because of decisions made by employers and employees over the organization of business and the paying of wages and the earning of profits, maybe we ought to organize business differently. Another way to say it. Americans like democracy. They like the idea that in the neighborhood where you live, in the town where you reside, you shouldn't have people telling you how to live, where to live, when to live. You should have the ability to vote for people, to vote them out of office if you're displeased with them. In other words, the people who are living with the results of the decisions of our community leaders should have power over them. I like that idea. I suppose most of you do. So here's a question. If that's a good idea in the community, how come it isn't a good idea at the workplace? How come? Why do we permit the workplace to be a place where you come, you do what you're told, how you're told, when you're told, where you're told, and when you're done, you go home and you leave behind what you've done, and your say over what's done with that is zero. You accept that. Why? If it isn't working well, if it produces 2 collapses in 75 years and 16 business downturns in between, and if it has half the qualities we've just gone through, what is your loyalty to that system? Wouldn't it be better to say that we ought to try democracy at the workplace?
The tragedy of American culture is that across the political and cultural spectrum, we are fed this mantra that if we dig deep enough within ourselves, if we focus on happiness, if we grasp that we are truly exceptional, if we find our inner strength, we can have everything we want. Reality is not an impediment to what we desire.
The American dream.
The American dream.
I've spent my whole life chasing the American dream.
I'm talking about the real owners now. The real owners, the big wealthy business interests that control things and make all the important decisions. Forget the politicians. The politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. You have no choice. You have owners. They own you. They own everything. They own all the important land. They own and control the corporations. They've long since bought and paid for the Senate, the Congress, the state houses, the city halls. They got the judges in their back pockets. And they own all the big media companies, so they control just about all of the news and information you get to hear. They got you by the balls. They spend billions of dollars every year lobbying to get what they want. Well, we know what they want. They want more for themselves and less for everybody else. But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest. That's right. They don't want people who are smart enough to sit around the kitchen table and figure out how badly they're getting fucked by a system that threw them overboard 30 fucking years ago. They don't want that. You know what they want? They want obedient workers. Obedient workers, people who are just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork and just dumb enough to passively accept all these increasingly shittier jobs with the lower pay, the longer hours, the reduced benefits, the end of overtime, and the vanishing pension that disappears the minute you go to collect it. And now they're coming for your Social Security money. They want your fucking retirement money. They want it back so they can give it to their criminal friends on Wall Street. It's a big club, and you ain't in it. You and I are not in the big club. And by the way, it's the same big club they used to beat you over the head with all day long when they tell you what to believe. All day long, beating you over the head in their media, telling you what to believe, what to think, and what to buy. The table is tilted, folks. The game is rigged. And nobody seems to notice. Nobody seems to care. Good, honest, hard-working people, white collar, blue collar, doesn't matter what color shirt you have on. Good, honest, hard-working people continue. These are people of modest means. Continue to elect these rich cocksuckers who don't give a fuck about them. They don't give a fuck about you. They don't give a fuck about you. They don't care about you at all. At all. At all. Yeah. You know? And nobody seems to notice, nobody seems to care. That's what the owners count on, the fact that Americans will probably remain willfully ignorant of the big red, white, and blue dick that's being jammed up their assholes every day. Because the owners of this country know the truth. It's called the American dream, because you have to be asleep to believe it.
And that's magical thinking. And it is rammed down our throats. Oprah does it every week.
Give you this figure, but how about if we give each person in your audience the brand new, totally redesigned 2012 Volkswagen Beetle?
Everybody does it. And that, in essence, has created a culture that is probably the most illusioned culture on the planet. And when you live in an illusion, you remain in a state of perpetual infantilism, childishness. You never grow up. And now that gap is opening between the illusion of who we think we are and where we're going, and the reality. I don't have any problem with going to vote. That's a process that at most takes 1 or 2 hours. That's all people do, and they think they've finished. Voting is such a minor part of beginning to reform and reshape our society. Look, I will not vote for Democrat. I was in there the last election voting for members of the Revolutionary Socialist Party. I didn't even know who they were. I don't care. I'm quite happy to muck up the system. But voting, and everybody should vote for the Green candidate. Great. But stop thinking that the route to reform is electoral politics. And I think that, we can create enclaves. We can vote people into positions of local power that act as some kind of a firewall against corporate abuse. But even if you vote people into local power, let's say, for instance, in a town in upstate New York, are you going to be able to stop these companies from fracking on your land? I mean, let's be honest. I mean, we have to be realistic. We can't talk about hope until we grasp the reality. Because otherwise, if we don't grasp the reality, then everything we do is futile. Because it is essentially appealing to a system that can't be appealed to. It is disheartening. But once we understand the paradigm of power, then we can begin to make decisions that can muck up that power system.
We can fight for something that is viable, that's real. The Democratic and Republican parties sure aren't going to do it. Did I say Democratic and Republican parties? Perhaps I should have just said the Republicrats, because that's what they are. We need to bring about parties, political parties today, that serve the interests of the people as opposed to pimping the people. The people are getting pimped, be they black, be they white, be they brown, be they red, be they yellow. The people in this country and around the world are being pimped. The only people who are going to stop the pimp are the people themselves. If you don't have, I mean, it's like a hamster in a cage that just constantly runs on that wheel. And so you remember, you run that wheel. I used to have a hamster when I was a kid. I used to watch that. That hamster was running and running and running. But it never went anywhere. Never got anywhere. We've got to stop being a hamster on that wheel. We have to stop salivating like Pavlov's dogs. Jumping back to, is voting even real? You know, my feelings, I'm ambivalent on that point. I believe we have to have systemic change. I go back and I quote the words of Albert Camus again when he said, what better way to enslave a man than to give him a vote and tell him he's free? We need to be creative of our own. I think that's up to us as a people as to what we're going to do or what we're not going to do. I'm hopeful. I'm very hopeful. And I was hopeful before Barack Obama was even born. And you translate that.
Hope will only come now when we physically defy the violence of the state. All who resist, all who are here today, keep hope alive. All who succumb to fear, despair, and apathy become an enemy of hope. They become, in their passivity, agents of injustice. If the enemies of hope are finally victorious in this nation, the poison of violence will become not only the language of power, but the language of opposition. And those who resist here today with nonviolence are the last thin line of defense between a civil society and its disintegration. Hope has a cost. Hope is not comfortable or easy. Hope requires personal risk. It is not about the right attitude or peace of mind. Hope is action. Hope is doing something. The more futile, the more useless, the more irrelevant and incomprehensible an act of rebellion is, the vaster and more potent hope becomes. Hope knows that an injustice visited on our neighbor is an injustice visited on all of us. Hope posits that people are drawn to the good by the good. This is the secret of hope's power. Hope demands for others what we demand for ourselves. Hope does not separate us from them. Hope sees in our enemy our own face. Hope is not for the practical and the sophisticated, the cynics and the complacent, the defeated and the fearful. Hope is what the corporate state, which saturates our airwaves with lies, seeks to obliterate. Hope is what this corporate state is determined to crush. Be afraid, they tell us. Surrender your liberties to us so we can make the world safe from terror. Don't resist. Embrace the alienation of our cheerful conformity. Buy our products. Without them, you are worthless. Become our brands. Do not look up from your electronic hallucinations, no. Above all, do not think. Obey. The powerful do not understand hope. Hope is not part of their vocabulary. They speak in the cold, dead words of national security, global markets, electoral strategy, staying on message, image, and money. The powerful protect their own. They divide the world into the damned and the blessed, the patriots and the enemy, the privileged and the weak. They insist that extinguishing lives in foreign wars or in our prison complexes is a form of human progress. They cannot see that the suffering of a child in Kandahar or a child in the blighted urban pocket of our nation's capital diminishes and impoverishes us all. They are deaf, dumb, and blind to hope. Those addicted to power, enthralled by self-exaltation, cannot decipher the words of hope any more than most of us can decipher hieroglyphics. Hope to Wall Street bankers and politicians, to the masters of war and commerce, is not practical. It is gibberish. It means nothing. And this is because they kneel before the idols of greed and money. If we resist and carry out acts, no matter how small, of open defiance, hope will not be extinguished. If all we accomplish today is to assure a grieving mother in Baghdad or Afghanistan, a young man or woman crippled physically and emotionally by the hammer blows of war, that he or she is not alone, our act will be successful. But hope cannot be sustained if it cannot be seen. Any act of rebellion, any physical defiance of those who make war, of those who perpetuate corporate greed and are responsible for state crimes, anything that seeks to draw the good to the good, nourishes our souls, and holds out the possibility that we can touch and transform the souls of others. Hope affirms that which we must affirm. Defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies, yet dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out, wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame.
Austerity with sweat at the foundry between the wars. I paid the union, and as times got harder, I looked to the government to help the working man. But they brought prosperity down at the armory, we're arming the peace, me boys, between the wars. I kept the faith, and I kept voting, not for the iron fist, but for the helping hand. For theirs is a land with a wall around it, and mine is a faith in my fellow man. Theirs is a land of hope and glory, mine is the green field and the factory floor. Theirs are the skies all dark with bombers, and mine is the peace we knew between the wars. Call up the craftsman, bring me the draftsman, build me a path from cradle to grave, and I'll give my consent to any government that does not deny a man a living wage. Go find the young men, never to fight again. Bring up the banners from the days gone by. Sweet moderation, heart of this nation, desert us not, we are between the wars.